Well, I am absolutely delighted to be here to speak with you about other Mainers at Gettysburg. Can everybody hear me in the back? I was a college professor for a long time, so I'm used to yelling as needed. This talk is a long time in coming. I actually first had the idea probably 2 years ago as I was dreaming to become a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park. The first step to becoming a battlefield guide is to pass what the Wall Street Journal ominously called the hardest test in history. A 6-hour exam, 3 hours in the morning, fill in the blank, and then in the afternoon, 3 hours of essays. And I would often come here to the Thompson Free Library to study. My wife, Wendy, is a Dover Foxcroft native, and her family has owned a camp on Sebec Lake for more than a century. The library has always been a place where our family could check out books and movies to while away the hours at camp. It has been good to us, and one day the notion hit me that I should give something back to the library, making a presentation here if I ever became a battlefield guide. That happy day arrived last May, and this evening I have the honor of being here to fulfill that long ago notion. The Thompson Free Library is one of Dover Foxcroft's great institutions, and I want to thank Joe and his staff for pardon me, John. Where did I get Joe from? John and his staff for being incredibly welcoming to us, and I know they have been to so many, if not all of you as well. Well, let me tell you what we're doing here this evening. I've produced 2 full-length films in my career, and as I spent time on the Gettysburg battlefield thinking about tonight's talk, I quickly decided I wanted to create a film as a way of transporting you to that hallowed ground. And this film has a twist. I'm going to be narrating it live, so we'll see how that goes. One more thing, this film includes a lot of what we call long takes, anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds, where I just focused on something on the Gettysburg battlefield and held the camera there. I invite you to listen to the stories I'm telling without expecting a whole lot of cool visual effects, although I'm kind of proud of the way we're going to zoom over the old map that I used several times. So please consider these long takes as opportunities to ponder the bravery, sacrifices, and quick thinking of those soldiers from Maine whose struggles during July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863 played their part in securing the Union and freedom for all Americans. And with that, let's go. I want to start with the word Mainers in the title of this film. Usually I think we mean specific people when we use Mainer, but for the most part this evening, I'm going to be using Mainer to refer to units of soldiers, artillerymen and infantry specifically. I'll talk plenty about individuals, but for the most part, I have in mind main units, things like artillery batteries and infantry regiments, by using the term Mainers. And then, yeah, there's that other word. When we speak of other, it always implies a one, a starting place, a thing or a person, or in this case, a Civil War fighting unit against which all others are compared. The one I have in mind tonight is the 20th Maine. Thanks to the book The Killer Angels and the film Gettysburg based on the book, the 20th is arguably the best known regiment in the entire Civil War, much less specifically at Gettysburg. Even serious Civil War buffs may be hard-pressed to list a regiment in the Stonewall Brigade, and others may struggle to identify a Union Army Corps that fought with Sherman as he marched to the sea. But the 20th Maine Regiment, that's something special. Piscataquis County sent more men to fight with the 20th Maine than any other county. And they fought here along the lower southern slopes of a rocky hill that would later be labeled Little Round Top. Late on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the 20th held on tenaciously for about 1 hour, at the end of which, with no ammunition left and no alternative, the men of the 20th Maine leapt to a stunning bayonet charge that saw the opposing Alabamians running through the forest of Big Round Top next door, quote, like a herd of wild cattle, according to the commander of those Alabamians. What the 20th did was special. and it deserves to be talked about with awe. In that short hour of combat, the 20th lost 32% of its men on this very ground. What incredible sacrifice. Yet, the day before, during the opening afternoon of the Battle of Gettysburg, you'll be hearing about the 16th Maine. The 16th lost 78% of its men, killed, wounded, or captured. And on the same afternoon as the 20th fight, the 17th Maine would lose 38% of its men, 6% more than the 20th. There were indeed other Mainers at Gettysburg, and the same thing can be said of them as was said by a 20th Maine private of his unit's fight on Little Round Top. Looking back years later, as if still urging on his comrades, Theodore Garish would write, quote, "Stand firm, ye boys from Maine, for not once in a century are men permitted to bear such responsibility for freedom and justice, for God and humanity, as are now placed on you." Let's look at what those other boys from Maine did at the Battle of Gettysburg day by day, beginning with July 1st. The Battle of Gettysburg, as I said, took place July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. It was the 27th month of the Civil War. The war would go on for 21 more months even after this huge battle. This was the largest of them all. 160,000 troops, north and south, fought at Gettysburg. 51,000 of them would be casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. And it seems that almost everywhere you turn on this battlefield, Mainers were in the thick of the action. That includes a number of firsts. For instance, Captain James Hall's 2nd Maine Battery fired the first artillery rounds of the Battle of Gettysburg in support of Northern infantry. Hall's Mainers were from mid and south coast counties. The battery, comprised of 6 cannons, was formed in November 1861, fought in several battles, and in early 1863 it was assigned to the 1st Army Corps. An Army Corps was a major subdivision of an army, roughly 12,000 men on the Union side. As circumstances would have it, the 1st Corps was the first Union infantry corps to arrive on the battlefield, stepping here onto McPherson Ridge, west of Gettysburg, about 10:30 in the morning. The fighting had begun 3 hours earlier, about 2.5 miles from the Gettysburg town square, and over that time, Union cavalry had put up a stout resistance against the Confederate infantry. But the Confederates had gradually pushed the cavalry back to McPherson Ridge, less than a mile from town. That's when the Union 1st Corps arrived. Near the front of the column that rushed to McPherson's Ridge was Hall's 2nd Maine with its 6 3-inch ordnance rifles, iron guns with grooved barrels that fired aerodynamic 10-pound projectiles as far as 2 miles, cutting-edge technology for the day. Hall's men were sent forward to this position on McPherson Ridge. Captain Hall set up his guns near the front edge of the Union line, stretching from the Chambersburg Pike toward an unfinished railroad located just beyond those trees that you see there. The Mainers began blasting away at Confederate guns just 3/4 of a mile away, immediately causing 2 of them to leave the battlefield for their own safety. The problem was, this position was the pivot point in a gigantic revolving door. To Hall's left, near the McPherson barn and stretching toward Herbst Woods in the background there, the Union Army was pushing forward. To his right, however, Confederate forces were overwhelming the New York and Pennsylvania infantry on either side, on the other side of the railroad cut, off in the distance there. Suddenly, Hall saw those Union troops fleeing to the east, to the rear. In moments, his battery was left all alone. He realized that, quote, if the position was too advanced for infantry, it was equally so for artillery. A basic ingredient of Civil War artillery placement was that it had to be protected, either by favorable terrain such as steep hills or by nearby infantry. Guns and their carriages weighed more than 1,500 pounds and were pulled by 6 horses. The gunners didn't carry rifles. Their complete attention was needed on the big guns. So moving a gun wasn't a simple process, and infantry would buy the time for artillery to literally limber up and move to a safe position if need be. Hall was furious at the lack of infantry protection, but to stay here would be risking a gunner's nightmare, the loss of his pieces. Far as Hall could tell, he was on his own, all infantry having deserted him. The cannon simply could not be loaded rapidly enough to stave off a concerted Confederate infantry attack, so Hall ordered a retreat. Captain Hall didn't see that the 147th New York Infantry, nicknamed the Plowboys, was almost single-handedly holding off an overwhelming number of North Carolinians and Mississippians, who were no longer moving east to west, but instead were sweeping around the right flank of the First Corps from north to south, nearly surrounding the 147th. As Hall's men moved to the rear through these open fields, they were under constant fire from Confederate infantry, and without Hall's battery to help stave off the Confederates, the 147th New York itself had to retreat. Only 3 of Hall's 6 guns left the first day's battlefield unscathed. 2 were severely damaged, and much to the captain's chagrin, 1 was left on the field for the Confederates to capture. When Hall found out, the fighting was still raging, but he and a sergeant rode out to the abandoned gun under fire and brought it back to Union lines. What a remarkable moment. Less than a mile away, and just a handful of hours after James Hall's Mainers stood their ground along McPherson Ridge right up to the last possible moment, more men from Maine found themselves in a completely untenable position. And we're going to be using that word untenable more than once here today. And what makes for an untenable position at Gettysburg? Terrain and large enemy numbers attacking from multiple directions play a role in nearly every instance that we'll see. In this case, it's the 16th Maine Infantry Regiment that will be challenged by both the ground and overwhelming enemy numbers. The 16th was part of Gabriel Paul's 1st Corps Brigade in John Robinson's division. They were the last to arrive on the battlefield, and they were the only brigade reserve available. Initially stationed to the west of the Lutheran Theological Seminary building, the side facing the oncoming Confederates, Paul's brigade constructed a U-shaped barricade there that would be of much use to others later in the day. Nearly a mile to the north of the seminary, the other brigade in General Robinson's little division, this one under Henry Baxter, was busy fighting off not 1 but 2 Confederate attacks. Their stance on Northern Seminary Ridge, just below Oak Hill, was exhausting of both men and ammunition, and at about 2:30, Robinson called for Paul's brigade to support Baxter's men. The fighting was almost continuous, but not intense until around 3:30. That's when Baxter's weary troops were withdrawn, and shortly before the Confederates finally managed to effectively organize their attack. While the 2 assaults on Baxter's men had been uncoordinated, the third, aimed only at Paul's men because Baxter's had already retreated, would come off exquisitely well for General Robert Rhodes's Confederate troops. More than 3,000 of those Southerners stormed off of Oak Hill to the north of what was now Paul's line, while simultaneously charging from the west. An attack from 2 directions is almost always a source of anxiety for a defending line, or defending force, pardon me. The ideal in the Civil War is that a defensive line would face its attackers head on, like boxers, going at one another in the ring. A 2-pronged assault of the sort Rhodes unleashed on Paul's line had all the makings of disaster. To make matters worse, the brigade was on its own, an island disconnected from any other Union troops, something it had in common with the 20th Maine. By now, General Paul had been severely wounded, and Division Commander John Robinson effectively stepped down a command level to become the brigade commander as well. He judged that the major assault was going to come there from the west, so he kept most of his force facing in that direction. As for the attackers coming off of Oak Hill to the north, those Confederates would have to be dealt with by just 2 regiments comprised of fewer than 600 men. The resulting shape looks like a backwards 7. The two lines created what's called a salient. It's just a fancy military word for angle. And if the Battle of Gettysburg teaches us nothing else, it is that salients are bad news for Union Army troops. On the Confederates came from the west and the north, threatening to wipe out Paul's thin line. Division Commander Robinson, and there he is, well understood the tenuousness of his position, and he ordered a retreat. However, the retreat had to be covered. One regiment had to be left behind, sacrificed, so that the rest could escape to Cemetery Hill, the designated Union fallback position located on the other side of town. Robinson rode over to the position where you see the tall monument there, where the 16th Maine stood, and commanded they hold the salient on their own. Colonel Charles Tilden protested, quote, that our regiment without support couldn't hold the ridge. We numbered fewer than 200. Robinson's reply was abrupt: hold at all costs. A downcast Tilden turned to his men and said, quote, you know what that means. It was nothing less than a suicide order. In the words of one soldier, the 16th was to be, quote, sacrificed to steady the retreat of the rest. Said another, quote, it meant death or capture, and every man realized it perfectly. The 16th Maine rushed to its right about 200 yards to assume the position at the vertex of the salient angle where the two lines come together. It must have been disheartening to be moving one way while the rest of the brigade was heading the other. Tilden wrote, and this is Tilden, quote, we got there just as a flag and a line of battle appeared across the way. A volley crashed and we saw some of our men fall. Our line blazed away in reply, and the rebel flag went down, and the officer pitched headlong into the stubble. But the attacking line came on, and behind it came another. The vastly outnumbered 16th fought like demons for perhaps 10 minutes, then began their own retreat. They likely didn't know much about where they were supposed to go. It's not like they had marched over Cemetery Hill on the way to battle. In fact, at their closest, they were probably 3/4 of a mile to the west of that high ground. But they had crossed an unfinished railroad on their way to the battle line, the same that saw fighting that morning. And now that's where they headed. Retreating through Wills's Woods, which you saw a moment ago, while turning to tenaciously fire at the fast-closing Confederates. Those Mainers then did something remarkable. Once they made the railroad cut here, an unfinished railroad at the time, they stopped, ripped their national and state flags from their flagstaffs, and proceeded to cut them into little bits and pieces as they were being shot down by the Confederates charging down this railroad cut. What in the world was the 16th Maine thinking? Every Union regiment carried 2 flags to help position the men in the smoke and chaos of battle. The thing is, those flags weren't purchased at the corner store. They were gifts from their home communities, the only things that the units carried that connected them collectively to the place they came from. To lose a flag was to lose a piece of home, as if the enemy had captured the town square, and that loss was too great to contemplate. That's why the surviving men of the 16th Maine paused to rip the flags to bits and stuff them into their pockets. Those flags were sacred to them, and they would sacrifice their freedom, even their lives, to prevent them from going over to the enemy. In the end, Colonel Tilden's regiment would lose 78% of their men. As I said earlier, 232 of the 298 who answered the roll call the day previous. It was payday in the Union Army, but so many of those men would never live to see a dime or spend a dime of that money. Those who were captured endured the horrors of POW camps, holding dearly on to those scraps of home in their pockets. And to this day, in museums here in Maine, you can see bits and pieces of the flag still on display. This one was carried into captivity by Colonel Tilden himself. He would escape in the Libby prison breakout, the largest of the war, and then again after being captured a year later. Not a lucky guy. It's a testament, though, to the tenacity of those boys from Maine. And as the 16th Maine was doing all it could to slow the North Carolinians, and Alabamians who were attacking them, a nearby battery from Maine was giving its all as well. Like James Hall's 2nd Maine Battery, Captain Greenleaf Stevens, and this is a photo much later in life, commander of the 5th Maine Battery, was attached to the Union 1st Corps, and it arrived on the battlefield around 11:30 on the morning of July 1st as the fighting was raging there west of town. Stevens's battery wasn't all Mainers, however, because of the terrific losses it suffered at the Battle of Chancellorsville 2 months before. 53 men from the 83rd and 94th New York Infantry regiments had joined it, men with no artillery background. There was time enough to train them, but only the battle would tell if they were up to the task of working the big guns when it counted. Originally posted south of the Lutheran Theological Seminary, the 5th Maine was later ordered here a couple hundred yards north of the seminary, and its 6 Napoleons, old-style, smooth-bore bronze guns like those that fired the round cannonballs commonly associated with the Civil War, were set up facing west, from where overwhelming numbers of Confederates were pushing the Union infantry toward Gettysburg, which is immediately behind this position. Stevens's battery comprised 1/3 of the 18 guns that were lined up, as the 1st Corps artillery commander would say, hub to hub, directly next to each other, so close that their fire was not only concentrated but actually overlapped from gun to gun. An entire Confederate Army Corps, 1/3 of Robert E. Lee's 66,000 infantry soldiers, was attacking toward Gettysburg from the west. So many men that their commanders were constantly feeding new brigades into the fight, troops who were ready to move rapidly. They were facing tired Union 1st Corps defenders, many of whom had been fighting for hours. Those Union men needed all the help they could get, and guns like those from the 5th Maine were the last available assistance, the final line of defense. Here, Stevens's gunners began plying their deadly trade. Coming at them were more than 1,350 North Carolinians, fresh troops brought in to finish off the last of the Yankee resistance. But it didn't work out that way. Stevens's guns blasted the Tar Heels under General Alfred Scales with tin cans filled with small iron balls like this one. When firing canister, Napoleons were effectively giant shotguns, and the results were brutal. Indeed, Stevens's guns and those nearby inflicted so many casualties that the North Carolinians stopped their charge. For the campaign as a whole, the only figures that we have, Scales's brigade of North Carolinians lost 704 men, 52% killed, wounded, and captured. No doubt many of those casualties were inflicted by the 5th Maine on July 1st. However, the story was very different on either side of the 5th Maine's position. There were not enough infantry, much less enough guns to hold off the Confederates to the north or the south, and soon the Union line was broken. At about the same time, the 16th Maine Infantry was tearing its flags from the flagstaffs. The 5th Maine Battery was limbering up a few hundred yards away, their position now untenable. So day one went about as poorly as it could have for the Union forces. 2 Union Army Corps, major subdivisions of the Army that engaged 17,000 troops, had been crushed by 25,000 Confederates, with roughly 15,000 casualties between the two sides. What saved the day from becoming a complete disaster for the Federals was Cemetery Hill, where you see the trees there above the town. That high ground was exactly the sort of position that the Union Army needed to take up, far better than its day one ground. And what would day two bring? Well, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, decided to attack both flanks of the Union battle line, and Mainers would be extensively involved in the defense on the right and on the left. Let's start with the left. We've already discussed the best known of the Maine units at Gettysburg, the 20th Maine, but the 20th likely would never have made its tenacious stand had not the 3rd Maine been sent forward to scout for the enemy hours earlier, a foray that radically changed the Battle of Gettysburg and, by extension, the Civil War itself. The 3rd Maine was part of the Union Army's 3rd Corps, commanded by this guy, Major General Daniel Sickles, who gained his first general star by raising 5,000 men to fight for the Union. The man had never spent one day at West Point. He was what was known as a political general. As such, he was more prone to misjudgment than others, and wow, did he misjudge things on July 2nd. Without Union Commander George Meade's permission, Sickles moved his 12,000-man corps up to 3/4 of a mile toward the Confederate battle line. But why? At daybreak on July 2nd, Sickles's corps was in its assigned position, last in line. It was to hold the left end of the Union battle line. Some have speculated that General Meade didn't trust Sickles's abilities and was confident the left flank was the least likely position of all to be attacked. No one knows for sure, but what ended up occurring was that Sickles all but invited an attack because he was concerned about some low ground along his position, never mind the very high ground here on Little Round Top that was also part of his assigned location. As it happened, where Sickles moved his units to was the very pivot point for the Confederate assault as Lee had planned it. And for his part, Lee planned to extend this line, his main battle line, south here. Sickles wanted to know if in fact that was happening, if the enemy was moving forces and lengthening their line along Seminary Ridge there, particularly if they had moved into his front, his sector of the battlefield, far enough that he would have to be concerned. And therefore, it would be a threat. Enter the 3rd Maine. The 3rd had already moved out to a piece of high ground between the Union battle line and what would eventually become the Confederate line. After this day, that position would forever be known simply as the Peach Orchard. Initially, the 3rd, an undersized regiment with only 210 men, the Union average was 350, was posted out front of Sickles's line to act as an early warning force. This is the Peach Orchard. When it was sent on its scouting mission, joined by part of the 1st U.S. Sharpshooter Regiment, it moved out here. Already 3/4 of a mile toward what would eventually be the Confederate battle line, the 3rd Maine scouting duties took them, as I said, the rest of the way. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning of July 2nd, a sharp firefight erupted between Union men off there in the trees and Alabamians under General Cadmus Wilcox, who were indeed moving south, lengthening Lee's battle line. This footage shows the Alabamians' movement toward the 3rd Maine and 1st U.S. Sharpshooter position. The fight only lasted 15 minutes, but it altered the Battle of Gettysburg. The scouting party reported the Confederates' movement and that they were heading south into the 3rd Corps front. That was all the information Sickles needed to push his entire corps forward toward the Emmitsburg Road, then bending back toward Devil's Den from the Peach Orchard. There's the Peach Orchard, here is Devil's Den, and here is the Emmitsburg Road. In doing so, Sickles accidentally but utterly disrupted Robert E. Lee's attack plan for the day, and therefore changed the course of the fight. It is Sickles' movement that indirectly resulted in the assaults on Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, and the Peach Orchard, some of the iconic locations on the Gettysburg battlefield. The Peach Orchard is exactly where the Confederate attack was originally planned to begin, but there weren't supposed to be any Union troops there. Now, with thousands of Federal infantry and dozens of Union cannons in that area, James Longstreet, the Confederate commander, who was supposed to initiate the attack through the Peach Orchard, had to come up with a plan B. Longstreet decided to stretch his 14,000-man attacking force nearly 1 mile south and begin the attack there, gradually moving north toward the Peach Orchard and then beyond. After its scouting mission, the 3rd Maine took up a position on the south edge of the Peach Orchard, probably pushing out farther there toward the Rose Farm as the Confederate attacks got closer and closer. Eventually, it was the turn of the Peach Orchard to be struck, in its case, by storming Mississippians under General William Barksdale, a former member of the United States Congress. Once more, a Maine regiment would be at the point of a salient. You'll remember the first salient I mentioned, where the undersized 16th Maine held on against overwhelming numbers of Confederates on the first day's battlefield before grudgingly giving way. Here at the Peach Orchard, the fight lasted a little longer, perhaps 45 minutes, but the results were the same. Maine men were sent running through trees, not a forest this time, but a peach orchard owned by Joseph Scherfy, as those Mississippians nipped at their heels with bloody intent. Salients are, as I mentioned before, bad positions to try to defend. Sickles's Peach Orchard salient virtually destroyed his own corps, and it resulted in a casualty rate of 58% in the 3rd Maine. More than half of those Mainers were killed, wounded, or captured. As they retreated pell-mell, the men from the 3rd Maine would have run past numerous cannons under the command of this man, Lieutenant Colonel Freeman McGilvery, a Mainer from Stockton near Belfast on the rugged coast, and an experienced seaman who, at moments, surely must have wished he were on the open ocean this day. But he was 600 miles from Maine, commanding the 26 guns of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Artillery Reserve. When General Sickles moved his men to the west and out of position without General Meade's approval, Meade rode to Sickles's new location. According to Meade, Sickles's account disagrees with Meade's on nearly every point, and certainly on this one, Meade outlined the myriad ways Sickles's new position was a poor one, and Sickles had just offered to move his corps back in line when the Confederates began their attack. Sickles was stuck where he was. The hot-tempered Meade must have been livid, but unlike Sickles, he was a professional soldier. Composing himself, Meade promised Sickles all the help he could send, and he encouraged Sickles to freely draw from the Union Artillery Reserve. The Artillery Reserve was huge, 108 cannons, and Sickles badly needed its help. In moving his 3/4 mile long line forward, he thinned it by 50%. Thereby, there simply was not enough men, were not enough men to cover all of Sickles's new 1.5 mile long line. And that's where Freeman McGilvery's guns come into play. It was McGilvery's battery that was summoned when Sickles's request for guns was received at the Artillery Reserve Gun Park about 2 miles from the Peach Orchard. A 1/4 mile gap in Sickles's line stood empty, right there, as you just saw. It was immediately east of the Peach Orchard, along what we know as the Wheatfield Road, and that's where McGilvery's men would unlimber. They did so, wrote one battery commander, quote, amid the zip of bullets, the whiz of shot, and the explosion of shells, adding that the men maintained the steadiness of veterans. As I mentioned, Longstreet's Plan B attack began about a mile south of McGilvery's position, well within range of these guns. So their first salvos fired long-range ammunition. In fact, it may have been a projectile from one of McGilvery's guns that severely wounded Longstreet's trusted division commander, John Bell Hood, knocking Hood out of the fight and leaving his division leaderless and uncoordinated at a crucial time. Later, McGilvery's line was busy trying to stop South Carolinians under Joseph Kershaw, who were menacing the 1st Volunteer Infantry Reserve guns. But an order was incorrectly understood, and those men from South Carolina suddenly turned from a north-facing charge toward the guns. I know that sounds crazy, charging cannons, right? But that was the order. To the east, exposing their flank. McGilvery's gunners blasted an enfilading fire coming in from the side. The South Carolinians were helpless against it. Years later, Joseph Kershaw would write of still hearing the clank of those canister balls against the stone barn of the Rose Farm. This is a different farm, though. Once General Barksdale's Mississippians had run off the 3rd Maine and the other infantry up on the Peach Orchard Rise, McGilvery had lost his infantry protection. The 21st Mississippi broke off from Barksdale's line and made it their special mission to chase McGilvery's guns. The Mainer ordered a retreat, with the Confederates giving chase over these 400 yards across the field to the trestle barn, which you can see there in the distance, shooting down so many horses that McGilvery's men had to retire by prolonge while firing. Instead of hitching up their guns properly to a 6-horse team, they used fewer horses and relied on the recoil from the guns to help move to a safer position. At the trestle farm, and I'm not sure, there we go, good. Wasn't sure if the video had stalled for a moment. At the trestle farm, which you see here, McGilvery instructed one of his batteries, the 9th Massachusetts, to hold on as long as possible while he rallied other units. The 9th did what it could, blasting the 21st Mississippi, but eventually the 9th had to abandon its guns. There were no horses left alive to haul them away. However, McGilvery's efforts to make a stand with his other guns and enlist yet more nearby were successful. A third of a mile from the trestle farm, he created the Plum Run line, named for a tiny creek above which he arrayed his assorted batteries. Here his men helped blunt Barksdale's determined push toward the Union Cemetery Ridge position, and the next day, guns under the command of Freeman McGilvery devastated Confederate troops marching in Pickett's charge. Today, Maynard McGilvery is honored with an avenue on the battlefield named for him. This stretch along the Wheatfield Road where his guns served up that awful canister fire against the South Carolinians. He is the lowest ranking Union soldier so honored. Hardly a quarter mile from the end of McGilvery's initial artillery line along today's McGilvery Artillery Avenue, a Maine infantry unit would find itself in what else an untenable position. It was the 17th Maine boys who hailed from the southern and westernmost counties in the state. The 17th, like the 3rd Maine, was part of Daniel Sickles's 3rd Corps. It was stationed along this low stone wall at the south end of Rose's wheat field, simply the wheat field as we know it today. The struggle there covered all directions of the compass. On the Confederate side, no fewer than 4 brigades were committed to the fight at some point, pushing through the woods and open ground from the south and west. For the Federals, following General Meade's promise to help General Sickles all he could, portions of the Union's 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps would come from the north and east to aid Sickles's defense of the ground that the 3rd Corps alone was assigned to hold. And the 17th Maine, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Merrill, was there from the start. From the low stone wall, the 17th fired the first volleys of this battle within a battle at Georgians under George Tige, short for Tiger, Anderson, who were storming through Rose's woods with bayonets fixed. Merrill's men poured a withering fire into the Georgians. So the Georgians were coming through the woods. This is the stone wall that you've seen some images of, along which the 17th Maine stood. The 17th Maine held on against charge after charge made by Anderson's men. They were an island unto themselves, as the 16th Maine had been the previous day, and the 20th was at almost the same time, disconnected from any other Union units to their right or left. But why? As I mentioned before, Sickles's line was far thinner than it should have been. So in the case of the 17th, the opportunity to connect with other regiments did not exist. But the Mainers fought fiercely, repelling every wave of Anderson's attacks. One recalled, quote, "The musketry fire reverberating in the woods made a fearful din." Finally, when South Carolinians pushed 3rd Corps Union troops and their 5th Corps reinforcements from off of Stony Hill, high ground to the 17th's right, the men from Maine had no choice but to retreat. Still, they only moved about halfway back across the wheat field to near the ridge line that you're going to see here in just a moment. That's the 17th Maine's wonderful monument. And here we can see a ridge line where you see those monuments there. That's where the 17th moved back to. Reinforcements were on their way. It was a crucial moment, one author has said, for the Battle of the Wheatfield and for Gettysburg itself. But those reinforcements were not yet at the wheat field. Men from Maine once again were to be sacrificed. The order came down for one regiment to stop the Georgians, and the 17th was chosen. Quote, "You must hold them with the bayonet," they were told. In some respects, the order was a repeat of the 16th Maine's suicide mission the day before. And as happened on day one, the 17th did as they were ordered, turning and charging the Georgians who had taken their stone wall. Now supported by a couple of other regiments, it was a brutal attack. A captain in the 17th would later write, quote, "Near the end of it, the struggle was almost hand to hand. There was no wavering or shadow of turning." But eventually the Mainers were played out. At last, reinforcements arrived. It was the Second Corps' supporting troops that I mentioned earlier, including the Irish Brigade with its 3 New York regiments and other troops from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Sources say the 17th Maine fought in the wheat field for roughly 90 minutes. And even after their departure, the wheat field struggle would rage on for another hour. Of the dozens of regiments engaged there that day, only Tige Anderson's Georgians on the other side of the stone wall fought longer, and the 17th's losses were substantial. Its 112 wounded was the 33rd most in the entire Federal Army at the battle out of 229 regiments. Over the roughly 3-hour fight, on the order of 20,000 men were engaged at the wheat field, with casualty estimates running as low as 4,000 and as high as 7,000. At the end of the day, it was said you could walk across Rose's 26-acre wheat field without your feet ever touching the ground, so thickly strewn were the dead, 18 of whom were men from the 17th Maine. By now, the sun was sinking in the sky, a time when fighting in the Civil War typically wound down. But 2 miles away, near the right end of the Union fishhook line, Greenleaf Stevens's battery, which had made such a staunch stand against attacking North Carolinians near the seminary building the previous day, would soon be firing its 6 Napoleon cannons at North Carolinians again. By the late afternoon of July 1st, Stevens had managed to get all 6 of his smooth bores to the safety of a small lump of ground known as McKnight's Hill, east of and adjacent to the higher Cemetery Hill. There is McKnight's Hill. I'll explain why it's called Stevens's Hill in just a moment. And Cemetery Hill is here and here. That evening, Stevens had his men construct lunettes like these that you see here in front of his gun emplacements, artillery earthwork shaped like a crescent moon that would absorb enemy counter-battery fire and infantry fire, thereby protecting guns and gunners alike. But it was also a dangerous spot, as evidenced by Stevens's wounding on the morning of July 2nd, likely by a sharpshooter firing from a building in Gettysburg hundreds of yards away. Command of the battery then fell to Lieutenant Edward Whittier. The sharpshooters sniping notwithstanding, the day was quiet on this sector of the battlefield, though Whittier and his men must have been anxious about the huge battle they could hear roaring off to their south in the peach orchard, the wheat field, and Little Round Top. Then, around 5 o'clock, 20 guns under the command of Confederate Boy Major Joseph Latimer, just 19 years old, opened fire from nearby Benner's Hill on the Union's Cemetery Hill position and at Whittier's location as well. It was a vicious gun, as another battlefield guide has termed these close-in artillery duels, but ultimately the shootout was won by the Union guns, with Latimer paying for the risky effort with his life. Typically, artillery bombardments like the one Latimer led were followed by infantry attacks, and that was the case here. The 5th Maine found itself helpless to assist in the repulse of the first of 2 Confederate assaults, infantry assaults, late on July 2nd. The initial one against Culp's Hill, directly east of McKnight's Hill and screened by dense woods. Could not abandon his position. The Mainers must have seen reinforcements rushing to assist the Union defenders just to their right, and they would have been concerned about a Confederate breakthrough. They been left with enough time to limber up and move their pieces, but eventually they found a distraction. The second of those infantry attacks began as the sun set. North Carolinians, under young Colonel Isaac Avery, had been hunkered down along the streets of Gettysburg, literally in the town. But as the Culp's Hill fighting began to subside, they slipped out to open ground, shielded from watchful Federal eyes by a low ridge line. This is where the North Carolinians and Louisianans would attack. The Louisiana fighters were the Louisiana Tigers, fearsome fighters who were eager to get into combat. Both had been involved the previous day, but those were mop-up operations. Now they were being, and so both the North Carolinians and Louisianans were relatively fresh, and now they were being sent out practically at dark, a dangerous proposition. And the object of their attack, Cemetery Hill, was protected not only by dozens of guns posted there, but infantry, and also 400 yards away by Whittier's 6 guns. The Louisiana position was closer to town. The North Carolinians marched to their left and were much nearer McKnight's Hill. This is the area the North Carolinians attacked up. So it was that, for the second time in 2 days, the 5th Maine played a central role in slowing a massive Tar Heel attack. As soon as the enemy came into view, the Mainers hurled projectiles at the 2 brigades. Whittier wrote that his guns, quote, enfiladed their lines with spherical case and shell, and later with solid shot and canister, expending the entire contents of the limber chests. The 5th had literally given the defense of Cemetery Hill its all. They had nothing left to fire at the Confederates, and their efforts certainly were effective. While many of the enemy casualties were suffered on East Cemetery Hill, thanks to the guns there and the Union infantry reinforcements that stormed over to help stop the attack, an unknown but surely substantial portion of the 434 casualties Avery's men suffered, including Avery himself, who was mortally wounded, would have come from Edward Whittier's guns. Cemetery Hill was secure and would not be assaulted by infantry again. Of the 5th Maine's performance, Henry Hunt, the chief of Union artillery, would say, quote, no better battery could be found in the United States service, either volunteer or U.S. Army. Finally, the fighting on July 2nd, 1863 was over, the bloodiest day at the Battle of Gettysburg, with 19,000 killed, wounded, or captured on the 2 sides. Yet it was an attack on the 3rd day that is the best known, not only of this battle, but of the entire Civil War, Pickett's Charge. And the 19th Maine was at the center of it all. The 19th's efforts at Gettysburg did not begin with Pickett's Charge. However, indeed, it had been moved out in front of the Union battle line on Cemetery Ridge into this space on July 2nd to help stop the final push of Confederate Corps Commander James Longstreet's huge assault against the Union position. The time was about 6 p.m. and Longstreet's attack had begun 2 hours earlier, rolling like a murderous wave from south to north across the rich farmland. Over this ground, the Floridians under Colonel David Lang came forward. They were rushing after the shattered remnants of General Sickles's ill-conceived and now broken battle line, and had not faced any organized opposition until they came on upon the 19th Maine. Union 2nd Corps Commander Winfield Scott Hancock personally placed the 19th near that thicket that you see in the distance. Pardon me, I've lost my space here, my place. Yeah, not long afterwards, one of Sickles's division commanders, leading his retreating men, tried to get the 19th to change position back to where they had come from to protect the 3rd Corps troops. But this man, Colonel Francis Heath, the 19th's commander, who reported to Hancock, not to a 3rd Corps commander, said to him, let your troops form in the rear and we will take care of the enemy in front. Soon a terrible fight began between the Mainers and the Floridians, all of them on both sides so far from their homes. It ended when Colonel Heath ordered a bayonet charge, calling to his men with a spirited, "Come on, boys." Heath led the regiment into the teeth of the Florida Brigade. The charge routed the Floridians, netting dozens of prisoners, an enemy regimental flag, and 3 artillery pieces that had been abandoned by Union guns. I'm going to pause this for just 1 second. I'm about 1 sentence behind myself. The 19th Maine was back at it the next day. It was positioned here, 300 or 400 yards north and east of the area where they had fought the previous day against those Floridians. And as it happened, they were in a perfect position to strike General James Kemper's brigade, the far left units in Pickett's charge from the Union perspective. As Kemper's men approached the designated strike point on the Union battle line, the famous copse or clump of trees, they swept in front of the 19th and numerous other Federal regiments. The boys in blue blasted away at them over this ground, and Kemper's men were shot down en masse. Soon the soldiers of the 19th realized that just a couple of hundred yards north of their position, the more concentrated Southern forces were threatening to break through the Union line. The Mainers were ordered to their right, joining hundreds and hundreds of other Federals in rushing to halt the only serious breach of the Union line during Pickett's charge. They stormed up this low rise, some of them actually running through the copse, something you can't do today because of the fencing that's there, and made any further Confederate advance impossible. Pickett's charge was over, and so was the Battle of Gettysburg. The 19th would end the battle with 170 wounded out of 439 total men, the 8th most of the 229 Union regiments at Gettysburg. Those wounded contributed to a 46% casualty rate in the regiment. For the first couple of days after the battle, virtually no outside help arrived at Gettysburg, and care for the 21,000 Union and Confederate wounded who were left behind was entirely in the hands of local residents, many of whom must have been in shock after the whirlpool of battle had enveloped the town. From the first day, there were troops completely surrounding Gettysburg, and between July 1st and 3rd, the fighting swept nearly all 360 degrees of the compass. The Union Army did leave 106 doctors at Gettysburg when it began its pursuit of the Confederates in earnest, starting on July 7th. But even if those surgeons had visited patients rather than operating on them, they each would have had to have attended to 200 wounded men every day spread out over miles of countryside. No, nurses were who was needed to keep the patients alive. There were several organizations that followed in the wake of the fighting to bring medical care, food, and more to the wounded, the best known of them being the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the U.S. Christian Commission. But others did similar work, among them the Maine Camp Hospital Association, which was co-founded and led by Isabella Fogg of Calais. On hearing of the battle in Gettysburg, Isabella left behind wagon loads of supplies in Frederick, Maryland, and rushed alone the 35 miles north into Pennsylvania, making her one of the first non-military, non-local caregivers on the battlefield. At Gettysburg, she created an impromptu soup kitchen, cooking hot food for the wounded using ingredients scrounged from nearby farms. Cooking and serving, as historian Tom Desjardins wrote, quote, farina gruel, beef tea, hot coffee, and hardtack in abundance. Isabella Fogg was lauded by Maine's leaders for her work on behalf of the Pine Tree State's soldiers. Ultimately, she would be the only woman to receive a disability pension from the U.S. government as a result of Civil War injuries. She died in 1873 and is buried in the Forest City Cemetery in South Portland. When we think of the huge bloody fight at Gettysburg, the places that come to mind include McPherson and Seminary Ridges, Cemetery Hill, the Peach Orchard, the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, the Copse, where Pickett's charge struck, and, of course, Little Round Top. Men from Maine were involved in the fighting at each of those famed locations. For its son's service, Maine lost roughly 25 27% of its men at the battle, the 8th highest rate of sacrifice of any Union state. The other Mainers discussed here found themselves in impossible positions, like James Hall's 2nd Maine Artillery and Charles Tilden's 16th Maine Infantry. They were repeatedly called upon to sacrifice, like the 3rd, 17th, and 19th Maine Infantry regiments. They helped turn the tide of battle by slowing massive attacks, as was the case with the 5th Maine Artillery. Indeed, the actions of that battery were so noteworthy that the hill they fought from was renamed in Commander Greenleaf Stevens's honor. That was the Stevens Knoll that you saw earlier. And individual Mainers not associated with Maine units, like Freeman McGilvery, or not associated with any fighting force at all, but rather caregiving, like Isabella Fogg, demonstrated tremendous initiative and persistence, whether almost single-handedly altering the course of the battle or working with independence and dogged determination to save lives afterwards. Such is the legacy of the other Mainers at Gettysburg. Thank you.